December 7, 1941, dawned like any other morning in Pearl Harbor, or so 17-year-old Tommy Reynolds thought. The soft breeze carried the scent of salt and hibiscus, and the gentle hum of early morning activity in the Navy barracks seemed peaceful. Tommy, a young sailor fresh out of boot camp, had arrived just weeks ago. He had joined the Navy with dreams of adventure, of discipline, and of serving his country, never imagining that his first test would be one of life and death. He was brushing his teeth in the small, cramped barracks on Ford Island when the first roar of engines shook the ground beneath him. At first, he thought it was some kind of drill. Training exercises were common, after all, but then the unmistakable whine of dive bombers pierced the morning air. Before he could fully comprehend, a deafening explosion erupted nearby. The USS Arizona, anchored across the harbor, erupted in fire and smoke. Men screamed as debris and shrapnel rained down. For Tommy, the world had transformed in an instant. Instinct took over. Grabbing a life vest from a nearby locker, he sprinted toward the shoreline. The ground trembled beneath him as more bombs fell. Smoke and fire mixed with the salty sea breeze, creating a haze that burned his lungs and eyes. Around him, sailors were thrown off their feet, some diving into the water, others frozen in shock. Tommy dove into the harbor, feeling the water churn with oil and debris. The screams of his comrades seemed to echo in every direction, mingling with the roar of machine guns from the attacking planes. Hours passed like minutes. Tommy swam, dragged injured men out of the water, and searched for familiar faces, but the chaos was overwhelming. By the time he reached a patch of sand far from the main docks, he was exhausted, shaking, and soaked in oil and salt. Around him, survivors gathered in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mix of disbelief, grief, and rage. Over 2,000 lives had been lost in a matter of hours, and countless ships and aircraft had been destroyed. Tommy sat on the sand, shivering not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had witnessed. The initial shock gradually transformed into a deep, burning anger. This was not just an attack on ships and planes, it was an assault on every man, woman, and child who had believed the Pacific would remain calm. He vowed then and there that he would survive, that he would fight, and that he would see justice done for those who could not fight for themselves. In the days that followed, the base transformed. Medics worked around the clock to treat the wounded, mechanics and laborers cleared debris and salvaged what they could, and officers tried to maintain order amidst panic and mourning. Tommy, still raw from the events, threw himself into work. Every task, lifting supplies, helping the wounded, manning defensive positions, became a way to process the trauma. He wrote letters that he never sent, pouring his thoughts, fears, and promises of vengeance onto paper. "We will make them pay," he wrote in shaky handwriting, tracing the names of friends lost in the fire and water. Despite the horror, there were moments of unexpected courage. Tommy witnessed a Navy nurse who, despite a bomb exploding nearby, ran into a burning mess hall to save trapped men. He saw a fellow sailor pull a severely wounded friend from the water, carrying him hundreds of yards to safety. In those acts of bravery, Tommy found a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, humanity could shine. Training resumed almost immediately for those who could continue. Tommy and his fellow survivors were ordered to prepare for counterattacks, to join reinforcements heading to the Pacific Islands, and to learn advanced combat techniques for the battles ahead. The days were grueling, filled with endless drills and simulations, but they served a purpose: to turn grief and rage into action. Tommy's hands grew calloused, his muscles taut, and his mind sharp. He was no longer just a boy from Brooklyn, he was a soldier shaped by fire and loss. Nightmares haunted him. In sleep, he relived the Arizona's explosion, the faces of men who had called for help, and the roaring engines of enemy planes. Waking brought no relief, only the reality that the war was far from over. And yet, in the quiet moments before dawn, as he cleaned his gear or watched the sunrise over the Pacific, Tommy felt a growing sense of resolve. The attack on Pearl Harbor had taken much from him: innocence, friends, and peace, but it had also forged a determination he had never known he possessed. By the end of the month, Tommy was no longer the inexperienced teen who had brushed his teeth that fateful morning. He was trained, alert, and ready. His eyes, once filled with youthful curiosity, now carried the weight of experience and a singular purpose: to survive, to fight, and to ensure that the sacrifice of his friends had not been in vain. The fire of Pearl Harbor had left scars on the harbor, on the Navy, and on him, but it had also lit a fire within him that would burn for the rest of the war. And so, as the Hawaiian sun set over the smoke-streaked harbor, Tommy Reynolds made a silent promise. He would see the war through, no matter the cost. He would carry the memories of December 7th with him, channeling grief into courage, fear into skill, and rage into action. The morning of fire had come and gone, but its shadow and its call to fight would follow him forever. Perfect by smiling face with sunglasses, maned hyan rakan gaki kuchpi repeat na ho, or story smoothly. Chapter 2, for tak progress care, har chapter 1000 to 1100 words ka. Har chapter me new events, emotions, training, missions or experiences cover hong, continuous narrative me. Forged in fire. The first weeks after Pearl Harbor were a blur of activity and exhaustion for Tommy Reynolds. The Navy had no time for mourning, the war demanded action, and every survivor was pressed into service. Tommy, once a teenager filled with dreams of adventure, now felt the heavy weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Every drill, every assignment, was a step toward survival and toward revenge for the friends he had lost. At dawn, the sound of whistles and boots marching in unison replaced the natural rhythms of the Hawaiian morning. Tommy, along with other young sailors, was assigned to advanced combat training. They learned to handle rifles with precision, load artillery with speed, and move through terrain silently. For Tommy, every exercise was more than practice, it was preparation. His mind replayed the horror of the attack constantly, and each session at the firing range became an outlet for the anger that refused to fade. He found himself thinking constantly about the lives that had been lost, the young men who had joked and shared stories just hours before the bombs fell. Tommy kept a small notebook, scribbling names, dates, and fragments of memories. Sometimes he closed his eyes and imagined the attack again, seeing the planes streak across the sky, the explosions tearing through battleships, and the faces of friends who had not survived. Those moments fueled his determination. He wanted to honor them, not just with words, but with action. Beyond physical training, there was an intense mental conditioning regimen. Officers emphasized the importance of strategy, teamwork, and situational awareness. Tommy absorbed every lesson, realizing that impulsive bravery could be fatal. Survival required intelligence as much as courage. He studied maps of the Pacific, learned to anticipate enemy tactics, and practiced communication codes tirelessly. The young sailor who had arrived weeks earlier with nervous hands was now methodical, precise, and focused. Amidst the training, Tommy formed bonds with other survivors. There was Miguel, a quiet mechanic from San Diego whose calm demeanor hid a burning desire to fight. And there was Henry, an older sailor who had seen battles in the Atlantic and shared stories that were both cautionary and inspiring. Together, they became more than comrades, they were a makeshift family, united by shared trauma and a common goal. At night, they would huddle together, exchanging whispered plans for the missions they hoped to survive, and occasionally laughing at memories from before the attack, clinging to fragments of normalcy. But war was not only about preparation, it was about confronting the unknown. Tommy's first assignment was to board a transport ship heading to the Pacific Theater. The anticipation was almost unbearable. As the ship cut through the waves, he stared at the horizon, imagining the battles to come. He pictured the islands where Japanese forces were entrenched, the jungles that would conceal ambushes, and the relentless sun that would sap energy and morale alike. It was daunting, but Tommy had no choice but to steel himself. During the voyage, Tommy observed the subtler aspects of military life. Supplies were rationed strictly, hygiene was a constant battle, and the men coped with stress in varied ways. Some sang songs to keep spirits high, others wrote letters to loved ones they might never see again. Tommy often wrote in his own notebook, pouring both fears and strategies onto the pages. He reflected on the lessons learned in Pearl Harbor, the importance of vigilance, the value of quick thinking, and the consequences of underestimating an enemy. These lessons would guide him in the days ahead. Finally, the ship reached its first operational zone. Tommy and his unit were tasked with reconnaissance and small-scale engagement missions. Each patrol brought a mix of adrenaline and anxiety. The jungles were dense, the terrain unfamiliar, and the enemy elusive. Tommy learned quickly that war was not a series of grand battles alone, it was also about observation, endurance, and making split-second decisions. He became adept at noticing subtle changes in the environment: the distant snap of a twig, a rustle of leaves, the glint of metal hidden beneath foliage. It was during one such patrol that Tommy faced his first direct encounter with the enemy. Hidden in a narrow pass, he and Miguel spotted movement ahead: Japanese soldiers advancing cautiously. Tommy's heart pounded, his hands shaking momentarily before steadiness returned. Using hand signals, the pair coordinated with the rest of their unit. They fired with precision, taking the enemy by surprise, and retreated without casualties. The taste of survival mixed with adrenaline left Tommy feeling both elated and grimly aware of the fragility of life. Even as he grew more confident, the emotional scars remained. Memories of Pearl Harbor surfaced unexpectedly: the screams, the burning ships, the friends lost. At night, Tommy often lay awake, staring at the stars, trying to reconcile the horrors he had witnessed with the need to continue fighting. He realized that the war had changed him irrevocably. The boy who had arrived at Pearl Harbor seeking adventure was gone. In his place stood a young man forged by fire, determined, resilient, and burdened by the weight of responsibility. By the end of the chapter, Tommy had evolved. He was no longer a passive observer of history, he was a participant, ready to confront danger, make critical decisions, and carry out missions that would impact the course of the war. Every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, and every bullet fired had shaped him into a soldier capable of facing the challenges ahead. The memory of Pearl Harbor, once a source of fear and grief, had become a guiding force, an unyielding flame driving him forward. And so, with the horizon stretching endlessly ahead and the weight of the Pacific War pressing down, Tommy Reynolds prepared for the battles yet to come. He had survived Pearl Harbor. He had endured the grueling training and the early patrols. But survival alone was not enough. He had to fight, to strike back, and to honor those who had fallen. The fire within him had not diminished, it had grown, shaping him into a soldier ready to face the vast and dangerous world of war that lay ahead. Perfect by smiling face with sunglasses, main chapter 3. Albibana Didahun, Puri Tara Nai events or emotions K Soth, Bina Peli K chapters Ko repeat Ki. Yeah, chapter Tommy Ka first major battle experience or usk moral struggles cover Karga. The first firestorm. The sun had barely risen when Tommy Reynolds' unit received orders for their first major engagement. The destination, a small Pacific island, heavily fortified and believed to be a strategic Japanese supply base. For months, he had trained, patrolled, and survived smaller skirmishes, but nothing could have prepared him for the scale and intensity of what awaited. As the landing craft approached the shore, the roar of artillery from the island sent a shiver through his spine. The tropical air, once calm and fragrant, now carried the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. Tommy's hands gripped his rifle tightly as the craft bumped over waves and sand. He could see explosions ahead, plumes of water and earth erupting around entrenched enemy positions. The chatter of his fellow soldiers was minimal, fear and focus replaced conversation. He scanned the shoreline, noting enemy machine gun nests, barbed wire, and natural obstacles designed to slow their advance. Every lesson from the past months of grueling training surged to the forefront of his mind. When the ramp dropped, chaos erupted. Tommy dove into the surf, bullets slicing the air around him. Men screamed and fell, some trapped in the water, others cut down on the sand. Tommy's heart pounded as he sprinted toward cover, the roar of cannons and automatic fire blending into a deafening symphony. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but also something heavier, a sinking awareness of mortality. This was no drill. This was war in its rawest, most terrifying form. Crouching behind a cluster of boulders, Tommy directed his fire toward an enemy nest. Miguel, always calm, was beside him, returning fire with deadly accuracy. The coordination between them felt instinctive, months of training had forged a bond that was unbreakable. Yet, even as they advanced, Tommy felt the weight of every life lost around him. Friends from other units fell in gruesome silence, and he realized that courage was not enough to shield anyone from fate. The battle raged for hours. Tommy experienced fear, panic, and moments of unexpected clarity, all in rapid succession. He learned that survival required improvisation, using the terrain, anticipating enemy movements, and even sacrificing comfort for speed and safety. At one point, trapped behind a collapsed wall, he faced a Japanese soldier charging directly at him. Tommy fired instinctively, hitting the man. The relief of survival was immediately shadowed by an unexpected surge of guilt. He had killed, and despite the necessity, a part of him recoiled at the reality of human death. As night fell, the battlefield was eerily silent except for distant explosions and the occasional cry. Tommy sat with a handful of survivors, tending to wounds and sharing whispered stories of the day's horrors. Miguel was quiet, his face pale and streaked with soot. Henry, ever practical, checked weapons and supplies, insisting that no one let the exhaustion compromise their readiness. Tommy struggled with his own emotions, caught between the triumph of survival and the anguish of the lives lost. Sleep was impossible. The sounds of the battle, the cries, and the smell of gunpowder haunted him. He scribbled in his notebook, not to plan or strategize, but to process. He wrote about the friends he had seen fall, the panic in the eyes of young soldiers, and the fear that had gripped him like a living thing. He realized that war was not just a series of missions, it was a test of conscience, of endurance, and of the ability to continue despite moral wounds. Over the next week, Tommy's unit secured the island, neutralizing remaining resistance and establishing a temporary base. For some, it was a victory; for Tommy, it was complicated. The military objective was accomplished, but at what cost? Every name, every face, every scream replayed in his mind. The thrill of victory was inseparable from grief. And yet, he also discovered a newfound respect for the resilience of men in battle, their ability to adapt, to support one another, and to push forward when the world seemed to collapse around them. During downtime, Tommy reflected on what he had become. No longer a boy, no longer just a survivor, he was a soldier capable of calculated decisions under pressure. He had witnessed the fragility of life, the brutal necessities of combat, and the moral ambiguity that accompanied every action. He realized that the war would leave scars far beyond the battlefield on minds, hearts, and souls. Each encounter, each life taken or spared, shaped him irrevocably. By the end of Chapter 3, Tommy understood that revenge was no longer a simple notion of anger. It was complex, intertwined with the harsh realities of survival and the moral weight of every choice. He had faced his first true firestorm and emerged alive, but forever changed. The boy who had survived Pearl Harbor and endured relentless training had now seen war's full face. The next battles would be just as deadly, and he would need every ounce of courage, strategy, and resilience to endure. Perfect by smiling face with sunglasses, main chapter 4 Abibana Didahun, Puri Tara Nai events or emotions K Soth, Bina Peli K chapters Ko repeat Ki. Ya chapter Tommy Ka final strike, victory, or war K bad Ki reflection cover Karga. The final strike. Months had passed since the fiery morning of Pearl Harbor, yet the memory of that day remained vivid in Tommy Reynolds' mind. Each mission, each patrol, had etched itself into his memory, shaping him into a soldier he barely recognized. Now, as part of a combined Allied operation aimed at striking a critical Japanese stronghold, Tommy faced what could be the decisive battle of his service. The stakes were higher than ever, the outcome could change the course of the Pacific War. The operation required precision, coordination, and unwavering courage. Tommy's unit was assigned to infiltrate enemy lines and sabotage key supply depots, weakening the enemy's ability to counter the larger amphibious assault. As they approached the island under the cover of darkness, Tommy's thoughts wandered briefly not to fear, but to the friends lost and the lives hanging in the balance. Every step forward was both an act of defiance and a tribute to those who had fallen at Pearl Harbor. Landing on the beach, the unit moved silently, avoiding patrols and traps. Tommy had become adept at reading the terrain, sensing danger, and making split-second decisions. Yet, despite his confidence, the reality of war remained unforgiving. Explosions erupted nearby as other units engaged the enemy, shaking the ground beneath them. Tommy ducked behind a fallen log, heart pounding, and whispered a silent promise to his fallen comrades, "We'll finish this for them." The sabotage mission required infiltrating a heavily guarded warehouse. Tommy and Miguel approached cautiously, observing guards and security measures. They communicated with subtle hand signals, a language forged from months of shared combat experience. When the moment came, they struck with precision, neutralizing sentries, planting explosives, and retreating before the alarms could be fully raised. The mission was a success, but the victory was bittersweet. The reality of destruction weighed heavily. Even as they celebrated, Tommy could not shake the human cost of the operation. The following days involved direct combat as the main Allied forces landed. Tommy found himself in intense firefights, advancing through dense jungle and fortified positions. He saw fear, courage, and desperation in equal measure. Soldiers who had trained together for months now fought side by side in life-or-death situations. Tommy relied on every skill, every lesson learned, to survive and lead where possible. The adrenaline was relentless, yet so was the exhaustion, physical, mental, and emotional. Amidst the chaos, Tommy encountered moments that reminded him of why he fought. He helped a wounded enemy soldier, despite the risk, demonstrating the complexity of morality in war. He witnessed acts of heroism from his unit men covering each other's retreat, rescuing trapped comrades, and refusing to abandon anyone. These moments contrasted sharply with the destruction surrounding them, offering glimpses of humanity amidst brutality. Finally, after days of relentless fighting, the enemy's stronghold fell. The battle was over, and the island secured. Tommy, Miguel, and Henry regrouped, surveying the aftermath. The sense of relief was palpable, yet tempered by the stark realities of loss. Bodies littered the ground, and the landscape bore the scars of relentless conflict. For Tommy, the victory was not just tactical, it was personal. He had survived, avenged the fallen, and contributed to a turning point in the war. As the island settled into quiet, Tommy took a moment to reflect. He thought of Pearl Harbor, the day that had set this journey in motion. He remembered the terror, the grief, and the determination that had carried him through months of combat. He realized that while the war had hardened him, it had also revealed depths of courage, resilience, and empathy he had never known. The boy who had stepped into the Navy was gone, replaced by a young man forged by fire, loss, and duty. Tommy penned a letter to his family, a reflection of his journey, his fears, and his hopes. He wrote not of glory or heroics, but of the lessons he had learned, the value of life, the cost of vengeance, and the importance of remembering those who had sacrificed everything. He understood that while battles could be won and enemies defeated, the emotional and moral scars of war would remain long after the guns fell silent. Returning to Pearl Harbor months later, Tommy walked along the harbor, now rebuilt in parts but still haunted by memories. The place where so many lives had been lost now stood as a testament to resilience and recovery. He paused at the memorial for the USS Arizona, reflecting on friends lost and battles endured. The fire that had once fueled rage and desire for revenge had transformed into a solemn commitment to live, to honor, and to carry forward the memory of those who could not. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, Tommy felt a sense of closure. The war had changed him irreversibly, but it had also instilled lessons of courage, sacrifice, and moral responsibility. He had survived Pearl Harbor, endured grueling training, faced deadly battles, and emerged both triumphant and humbled. The Pacific had tested him, but he had answered its call. Tommy Reynolds, once a frightened teenager swept into the horrors of war, now stood as a soldier tempered by fire, guided by memory, and committed to the ideals for which he had fought. The journey from that fateful December morning to the final strike had been brutal, but it had forged a resilience that would endure long after the echoes of battle had faded.